Dr. Sarah Chen pressed her back against the rocky cave wall, feeling the heat from the raging forest fire outside seeping through the stone. The acrid smoke made her eyes water as she clutched the emergency beacon in her trembling hand. 3 days ago, she had been conducting routine xenobiology research on Kepler-442b. Now she was trapped in a burning alien wilderness with creatures that could tear her apart without a second thought. The Vorthak cubs, huddled in the deepest part of the cave, their obsidian black fur rippling with bioluminescent patterns that pulsed faster when they were afraid. Each cub was already the size of a large dog, despite being only months old. Their parents would grow to be apex predators standing 8 feet tall, with razor-sharp claws and teeth that could crush titanium alloy. The Galactic Council had classified them as one of the most dangerous species in known space. Sarah's research team had discovered this family den 3 weeks ago. Unlike the violent, territorial adults that patrolled the deeper forests, these cubs showed curiosity rather than aggression. She had spent countless hours observing their play patterns, their communication through color changes in their fur, and their remarkable intelligence. When the plasma storms hit the planet's atmosphere, triggering massive electrical fires across the continent, her team had evacuated to the orbital station. Sarah had stayed behind to gather final data samples. She never expected the fires to spread this fast. The cave mouth glowed orange-red as burning trees crashed outside. The adult Vorthak had fled deeper into the mountain ranges days ago, but these cubs were too young to make the journey. Their mother had been killed by falling debris during the first night of fires. Their father hadn't returned. Sarah had found them crying out in harmonious wails that made her chest ache with their obvious distress. Every logical part of her mind screamed to activate the beacon and call for evacuation. The rescue shuttle could reach her in 20 minutes. She could be safe on the orbital station within an hour, filing reports and analyzing data in climate-controlled comfort. The cubs would die, but they were just animals. Dangerous animals that would grow up to hunt anything that moved, including humans. But Sarah couldn't stop watching the way the smallest cub, barely the size of a house cat, pressed against his larger siblings for comfort. She had named him Flicker because of the rapid light patterns he made when he was nervous. He reminded her of her childhood dog, the way he tilted his head when she spoke, the way he tried to comfort the others even though he was clearly the most frightened. "You're not supposed to be this smart," she whispered to them in the darkness. "The xenobiology report said you were just predators. No complex emotions, no family bonds, no capacity for reasoning beyond basic survival." The reports had been wrong. Dead wrong. Flicker's older sister, who Sarah called Luna for her silver-tipped ears, had figured out how to stack rocks to reach higher cave ledges. Their brother Storm had learned to mimic the warning calls of other forest creatures to alert his siblings when the fires came too close. They worked together, communicated with purpose, and showed genuine affection for each other. Sarah's oxygen mask filtered the worst of the smoke, but she could feel her supplies running low. The environmental suit's power cells would last maybe 6 more hours. The beacon in her hand grew heavier with each passing minute. Her training told her to prioritize her own survival. Her mission parameters were clear: observe, document, and extract safely. Getting killed for a pack of alien predators wasn't part of the plan. But watching Luna gently groom Flicker's singed fur, seeing Storm position himself between his siblings and the cave mouth, despite his own obvious fear, Sarah knew she couldn't abandon them. Not when they displayed the same protective instincts, the same family loyalty, the same desperate love that she recognized from every human family she'd ever known. The fire outside roared louder. A massive tree trunk crashed across the cave entrance, partially blocking their exit. The cubs huddled closer together, their bioluminescent patterns now pulsing in synchronized waves of deep blue, a color Sarah had learned meant extreme distress. Flicker let out a small whimper and looked directly at her, his large eyes reflecting the distant firelight. In that moment, Sarah made her choice. She clipped the emergency beacon to her belt without activating it and moved deeper into the cave toward the cubs. Storm immediately positioned himself in front of his siblings, his young claws extending in a defensive posture. But Sarah had learned their body language over weeks of observation. She kept her movements slow and deliberate, making the soft clicking sound with her tongue that seemed to calm them. "I'm not leaving you," she said quietly. "I don't care what the protocols say. I don't care what species you are. No child should die alone and afraid. Luna tilted her head, her silver ears twitching. The bioluminescent patterns on her fur shifted from distressed blue to cautious yellow. Sarah had seen this color during feeding times when the cubs were uncertain but willing to trust. Storm's defensive stance relaxed slightly, though he kept his claws ready. Sarah opened her emergency supply pack and pulled out high-energy nutrition bars. She had no idea if the cubs could digest human food, but they had been without their mother's milk for days. They needed something. She broke a bar into small pieces and placed them on the cave floor, then backed away to give them space. Flicker was the first to approach. He sniffed the food carefully, his whiskers twitching. After a moment's hesitation, he took a small bite. His eyes widened and he made a soft purring sound that Sarah had never heard before. Within minutes, all three cubs were eating gratefully. As Sarah watched them share the meager meal, dividing it equally despite their obvious hunger, she felt her resolve strengthen. These weren't just animals operating on instinct. They were individuals with personalities, emotions, and moral codes that rivaled any humans. The galaxy might fear their species, but these cubs were innocent. They deserved a chance to live. The fire continued to rage outside, and Sarah's beacon remained unactivated. She had made her choice, and there was no turning back. Whatever happened next, she would face it with these remarkable young creatures. They would survive together, or they would die together. But Sarah Chen was human, and humans had a long history of refusing to accept impossible odds. The cave grew hotter as dawn approached. Sarah had spent the night studying the cave system with her suit's scanning equipment, searching for another way out. The main entrance was now completely blocked by burning debris, but her sensors detected air currents coming from deeper in the mountain. There had to be another passage. Flicker had curled up against her leg during the night, his small body radiating warmth. Sarah found it remarkable how quickly the cubs had accepted her presence. Storm still watched her with cautious intelligence, but even he had allowed her to examine a burn on his shoulder. Luna had been the most trusting, actually bringing Sarah small stones and arranging them in patterns, as if trying to communicate. As the morning light filtered through cracks in the debris pile, Sarah heard something that made her blood freeze, the distinctive whine of plasma engines. She activated her suit's external sensors and detected 3 ships in the area. For a moment, hope flared in her chest. Maybe her research team had returned to rescue her. Then she identified the ship signatures, Cretan Raiders, the galaxy's most ruthless hunters and slavers. Sarah's heart sank as she listened to their communications on the emergency frequencies. They weren't here for rescue. They had detected the plasma storm damage and come to scavenge valuable resources, including rare alien specimens. The Vorthak cubs would be worth a fortune on the black market, sold to private collectors or illegal fighting rings. Sensor readings confirm multiple life signs in the cave system, came a gravelly voice over the radio. Large mammalian predators, juvenile specimens. These will fetch premium prices. Sarah looked down at Flicker, who had woken up and was watching her with those intelligent eyes. She could activate her beacon now, signal the Cretan that she was human, and they would probably let her go. Her species had diplomatic immunity with most raider clans. She could walk away and save herself, but the cubs would be captured, sold, and forced to fight for entertainment until they died. Not happening, Sarah muttered, switching off her external communications. She gathered her equipment and moved toward the back of the cave. "Come on, you 3. We're getting out of here." The cub seemed to understand urgency in her voice. Luna immediately started following, with Storm herding Flicker along behind her. Sarah was amazed by their coordination. These cubs had natural teamwork abilities that put most human military units to shame. The passage Sarah had detected led deeper into the mountain, winding through natural rock formations carved by centuries of underground water flow. Her suit's lights illuminated crystal formations that sparkled like captured starlight. Under other circumstances, it would have been beautiful. Now it was just a potential escape route. Behind them, Sarah could hear the Cretan raiders using plasma cutters to clear the cave entrance. They would break through within hours. The passage ahead was narrow in places, barely wide enough for Sarah to squeeze through. But the cubs moved with fluid grace through spaces that seemed impossible for their size. 3 hours into their underground journey, they reached a junction where the passage split into multiple tunnels. Sarah's sensors were practically useless this deep in the mountain. Too much interference from mineral deposits. She had to make a choice based on airflow and her limited geological knowledge. That's when Storm surprised her. The young Vorthak moved to the leftmost tunnel and made a series of complex clicking sounds. Luna immediately responded with her own vocalizations, and Flicker added what sounded like confirmation calls. Storm looked back at Sarah and deliberately started down the left passage. "You know the way, don't you?" Sarah whispered in amazement. "Your species has instinctual knowledge of cave systems." It made perfect sense. Adult Vorthak were known to use vast underground networks to move across continents undetected. The cubs must have inherited genetic memories of tunnel navigation, even at their young age. Following Storm's lead, they descended through increasingly complex passageways. Sarah's environmental suit was running low on power, and her oxygen reserves had dropped to critical levels. But she pushed forward, driven by determination and something else she couldn't quite name, a fierce protective instinct that felt almost maternal. They emerged into a vast underground cavern lit by bioluminescent fungi growing on the walls. The air was cleaner here, and Sarah detected multiple passages leading in different directions. Storm led them toward what appeared to be a natural ramp leading upward. That's when they heard the hunting calls echoing through the tunnels behind them. The Cretan had brought tracking beasts, bioengineered creatures, designed to follow scent trails through any terrain. Sarah could hear their howls getting closer, accompanied by the heavy footsteps of their handlers. "How many humans are willing to die for animals they've known for 3 weeks?" came a mocking voice over a portable speaker, carried by sound through the cave system. "Surrender now and we'll grant you safe passage off-world. Continue this foolishness and you'll die with your pets." Sarah checked her remaining supplies. 1 energy bar, half her water, and maybe 2 hours of oxygen left. Her suit's emergency beacon could still summon a rescue shuttle, but it would take too long. The raiders would catch them long before help arrived. Luna made a soft, questioning sound, her bioluminescent patterns shifting to concerned yellow. Flicker pressed against Sarah's leg, and Storm positioned himself at the mouth of the upward passage, ready to defend his family. Looking at these 3 remarkable young beings, Sarah felt something crystallize in her mind. This wasn't just about saving alien animals anymore. This was about protecting children. It was about standing up to bullies who profited from suffering. It was about proving that sometimes the right choice was the hard choice, even when, especially when, nobody was watching. "I've spent my career studying courage in different species," Sarah said quietly, more to herself than to the cubs. "Turns out courage isn't unique to humans, but stubbornness? That might be our special gift." She gathered what remained of her supplies and started up the ramp after Storm. Behind them, the hunting calls grew louder, but Sarah no longer cared about the odds. She had made her choice and she would see it through to the end. The cubs followed her with absolute trust, their bioluminescent patterns now pulsing in synchronized waves of determined gold. Whatever lay ahead, they would face it together. And if the galaxy underestimated what a human would do to protect innocent lives, well, they were about to learn something new about her species. The upward passage opened onto a rocky ledge overlooking a vast canyon. The morning sun revealed the devastating scope of the plasma fires. Entire forests reduced to smoldering ash for as far as Sarah could see. But the canyon itself was untouched, its steep walls providing natural fire breaks. More importantly, Sarah's sensors detected water sources and indigenous plant life that hadn't been affected by the flames. The cubs could survive here, at least temporarily. "This is where we part ways," Sarah told them softly, knowing they couldn't understand her words but hoping they might grasp her intent. Her oxygen gauge showed 30 minutes remaining. Even if she activated her beacon now, rescue wouldn't arrive in time. But the cubs had a chance if she could buy them enough time to disappear into the canyon's maze of caves and crevices. Storm looked up at her with those intelligent eyes and made a series of rapid clicks. Luna responded immediately. Then Flicker added his own vocalizations. To Sarah's amazement, the 3 cubs moved to surround her, forming a protective circle with her at the center. No, that's not how this works," she protested, but Storm gently but firmly pushed against her leg, guiding her away from the canyon edge. "You're supposed to run away and be safe. I'm supposed to buy you time." The hunting howls echoed up from the passages below, much closer now. Sarah estimated 10 minutes before the Cretan reached their position. She had to make the cubs understand that they needed to flee. That's when Luna did something extraordinary. The young Vorthak picked up a small stone and began arranging it with others in a deliberate pattern. Within moments, she had created a crude but recognizable map of the passage system they had just traveled, complete with markers showing where they had encountered obstacles and where they had found safety. "You're trying to teach me the way back," Sarah breathed in amazement. "You think we're all going together?" Storm confirmed this by moving to her equipment pack and carefully extracting her emergency beacon with his claws. He placed it at Sarah's feet and looked at her expectantly, his bioluminescent patterns shifting to encouraging green. Flicker, meanwhile, had discovered something else. The smallest cub was investigating Sarah's portable scanner, and somehow his natural bioelectric field was interacting with the device's energy cells. The power gauge that had been showing critical levels suddenly jumped to 50% charge. "How are you doing that?" Sarah stared as Flicker continued his curious exploration of the scanner. Her environmental suit's systems began showing improved power levels too, simply from his proximity. "You're some kind of living battery." The pieces clicked together in her mind. Vorthak were known to generate powerful bioelectric fields for hunting, but the cub's developing systems might be perfectly tuned to human technology frequencies. If Flicker could boost her suit's power, they might have enough air and energy to make it somewhere safe together. The howls below grew louder, joined now by harsh Cretan voices echoing through the stone passages. Sarah made a decision that went against every bit of survival training she'd ever received. Instead of activating the beacon to call for rescue, she clipped it to Storm's harness. "If something happens to me," she told him, knowing he couldn't understand but needing to say it anyway, "this will bring help. Hide until you hear human voices, then activate it by pressing the red button." Storm looked down at the beacon, then back at Sarah. His expression was so human-like, so filled with understanding and determination, that Sarah felt her throat tighten with emotion. "We need to move," she said, gathering her equipment. "All of us. Together." Following Luna's map markings, they began descending into the canyon through a narrow trail barely visible between the rocks. Sarah's suit, boosted by Flicker's bioelectric field, showed stabilized life support readings. They might actually have a chance. The descent was treacherous. The trail was clearly designed for creatures with claws and natural climbing abilities, not for humans in bulky environmental suits. But the cubs worked together to help her, with Storm scouting ahead for unstable rocks, Luna finding the safest footholds, and Flicker staying close to maintain the power boost. Halfway down the canyon wall, they heard plasma blasts echoing from above. The Cretan had reached the ledge and were firing into the canyon, trying to flush out their quarry. Chunks of rock exploded around them, sending debris tumbling into the depths below. "Target acquired," came a voice from above. 4 life signs descending the eastern wall. More plasma fire erupted around them. Sarah pressed herself against the rock face as superheated energy bolts carved smoking craters in the stone. A blast struck just inches from her helmet, and she felt the heat even through her suit's insulation. Storm made a decision that nearly stopped Sarah's heart. The young Vorthak deliberately exposed himself on a prominent ledge and roared a challenge that echoed throughout the canyon. It was a magnificent sound, full of fury and defiance, and it drew immediate plasma fire from all 3 raider positions. While Storm drew their attention, Luna and Flicker helped Sarah reach a sheltered overhang 20 feet below. Then Storm performed a feat of agility that defied physics, leaping and ricocheting off canyon walls to reach their position in a series of bounds that would have made adult Vorthak proud. "Show-offs," Sarah muttered, but she was grinning despite their desperate situation. These cubs had more courage and tactical awareness than most trained soldiers. They reached the canyon floor just as Sarah's original oxygen supply ran out completely. But Flicker's bioelectric boost was maintaining her suit's air recycling systems at 60% efficiency, giving her maybe another hour of breathing time. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep moving. The canyon bottom was a maze of boulders, underground streams, and cave openings that led deeper into the mountain. Storm led them toward the largest cave entrance, but before they could reach it, the distinctive whine of plasma engines echoed from above. The Cretan had brought their ships into the canyon. "Surrender now," came an amplified voice from the lead vessel. "You cannot hide from our sensors forever." Sarah looked up at the 3 ships hovering overhead, their weapon systems tracking back and forth across the canyon floor. Then she looked at Storm, Luna, and Flicker, who had positioned themselves around her in another protective formation. "You know what?" she said aloud, activating her suit's external speakers so the raiders could hear her. "I don't think we're going to surrender. I think we're going to do something incredibly stupid instead. She pulled out her emergency beacon and held it up where the ships could see it. But instead of activating the rescue signal, she began modifying its power output using her suit's engineering tools. Flicker, seeming to understand her intent, moved closer and allowed his bioelectric field to interact with the device. The beacon began to emit a high-frequency pulse that made the Cretan ship's instruments go haywire. Sarah had turned it into an improvised electromagnetic weapon, powered by alien bioelectricity and human ingenuity. Impossible, came the lead pilot's voice as his ship lurched sideways, its navigation systems failing. Sarah smiled grimly as she watched the ship struggle to maintain altitude. Sometimes the best defense was a good offense, and sometimes the most dangerous thing in the galaxy was a human who refused to give up. The real fight was just beginning. The lead Cretan ship crashed into the canyon wall with a thunderous impact that shook the ground beneath Sarah's feet. The pilot had managed to activate emergency thrusters at the last second, preventing a total catastrophe, but the vessel was clearly disabled. The other two ships retreated to a safer distance, their crews frantically trying to understand what had just happened. How did a human xenobiologist disable a military-grade raider ship? Came an angry voice over the communications channel. Sarah allowed herself a moment of satisfaction before reality set in. The improvised electromagnetic weapon had drained both her beacon's power cells and severely taxed Flicker's bioelectric reserves. The small cub was swaying on his feet, his bioluminescent patterns flickering weakly. She had maybe 20 minutes of air left, and the remaining ships would be taking a much more cautious approach. Storm was studying the crashed vessel with obvious intelligence. His head tilted as he analyzed the situation. Then he made a series of rapid clicks to his siblings and began moving toward the wreckage. Luna and Flicker immediately followed, and after a moment's hesitation, so did Sarah. "What are you planning?" she asked, though she was beginning to understand these cubs well enough to guess. The crashed ship had torn a huge gash in its hull during impact, exposing internal systems and cargo holds. Storm led them to what appeared to be a breach in the vessel's power core housing. The cubs positioned themselves around the opening, and their bioluminescent patterns began to pulse in perfect synchronization. Sarah's scanner readings spiked as the three cubs somehow harmonized their bioelectric fields. The ship's emergency power systems flickered and died, then roared back to life with 3 times their normal output. Every system on the vessel was now running on Vorthak bioelectricity instead of standard power cells. "Incredible," Sarah whispered. "You're not just generating electricity. You're learning to interface directly with alien technology." Through the ship's hull breach, she could see Cretan raiders trapped inside, unconscious from the crash but still alive. Their weapons and equipment were scattered throughout the cargo hold. More importantly, Sarah spotted something that made her heart race with possibilities. A fully charged rescue pod designed for emergency evacuations. The remaining 2 ships above were repositioning for another attack, but they were being extremely cautious now. Their pilots were clearly trying to figure out how to capture the cubs without risking another electromagnetic assault. "Attention. Dr. Chen," came a new voice over the communications channel. This one speaking with cultured authority rather than raider aggression. "I am Commander Vexathari of the Cretan Merchant Fleet. We have no desire to harm you. Release the specimens to our custody, and we will provide safe transport to any human outpost you choose." Sarah almost laughed. They were trying to negotiate now, which meant they were worried. "Good. Counteroffer," she replied, activating her suit's communication system. "Leave this system immediately and I won't turn your other 2 ships into scrap metal." "You disabled 1 vessel through luck and desperation," Vexathari responded. "You cannot repeat that feat. Want to bet?" As if responding to her challenge, the 3 cubs began moving toward the ship's weapons systems. Storm's claws interfaced with targeting controls while Luna connected to navigation, and Flicker merged his bioelectric field with the main cannon's power supply. The ship's plasma weapons, originally designed to fire down into the canyon, began rotating upward toward the remaining raiders. "Impossible," Vexathari breathed. "Vorthak cubs cannot have that level of technological integration." "These cubs can," Sarah said proudly. "And they're very protective of their family." The massive plasma cannon locked onto the nearest ship and charged to full power. The Cretan vessel immediately began evasive maneuvers. but its movements were predictable to Luna's enhanced navigation interface. The second ship moved to flank them, only to find Storm had already calculated its approach vector and was tracking it with secondary weapons. "Stand down," Vexthari ordered, his composure finally cracking. "You're controlling a military weapons platform with untrained animals." "They're not animals," Sarah replied firmly. "They're children, and they're smarter than your entire crew." To prove her point, Flicker did something that defied every assumption about Vorthak intelligence. The small cub began accessing the ship's communication systems and, within moments, was broadcasting a complex mathematical sequence that Sarah recognized as a proof of sentience, the universal signal used by spacefaring species to demonstrate advanced intelligence. The sequence was perfect, elegant, and delivered in harmonized bioelectric pulses that no mere animal could have conceived. "By the galactic accords," Vexthari whispered, "if those creatures are demonstrably sentient, then capturing them constitutes slavery, which carries a death penalty under pan-galactic law." Sarah finished. "These cubs have just proven they're not animals, Commander. They're people, and people have rights." The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah could almost hear the Cretan crews processing the implications. Raiding non-sentient creatures was illegal but profitable. Enslaving proven sentient beings was a capital crime that would bring the full weight of galactic civilization down on them. Storm's targeting system was still locked onto the nearest ship, but his bioluminescent patterns had shifted to what Sarah had learned meant waiting for decision. He was giving the raiders a chance to make the right choice. Luna was monitoring all communication channels, her silver-tipped ears twitching as she analyzed data streams. Flicker continued broadcasting mathematical proofs, each sequence more complex than the last, building an undeniable case for Vorthak intelligence. "Dr. Chen," Vexthari said finally, his voice carefully controlled. "What are your terms?" Sarah looked down at the three cubs who had trusted her enough to follow her into mortal danger, who had shared their power to keep her alive, who had proven themselves capable of mercy even toward those who would have enslaved them. "Full withdrawal from this system," she said, broadcasting a public retraction stating that Vorthak are sentient beings, protected under galactic law, and a formal apology to these three individuals for the attempt to capture them. "And in return?" Sarah smiled. "In return, you get to live. And maybe you learn something about underestimating species you don't understand." The cubs' bioluminescent patterns had synchronized into waves of patient gold, but their connection to the ship's weapons remained active. They were ready for peace but prepared for war. It was the most human thing Sarah had ever seen an alien species do. "Terms accepted," Vexthari said after a long pause. "Cretan fleet withdrawing. Dr. Chen, your species' reputation for stubborn protectiveness is well deserved." As the raider ships retreated into the upper atmosphere, Sarah finally activated her emergency beacon, not for rescue, but to broadcast the cubs' mathematical proofs to every listening station in the sector. Within hours, the evidence of Vorthak sentience would be spreading throughout galactic civilization. Storm, Luna, and Flicker had just secured freedom for their entire species, and they had done it by learning to trust a human who refused to abandon them. The nest had burned around them, but they had all emerged stronger. 3 hours after the Cretan withdrawal, the first response came from an unexpected source. The massive bulk of a galactic peacekeeping vessel materialized in orbit above Kepler 442b, its sleek silver hull reflecting the system's orange sun. Sarah's emergency beacon had done more than broadcast the cubs' mathematical proofs. It had triggered automatic protocols for first contact with newly recognized sentient species. "Dr. Chen, this is Admiral Korath of the GPS Harmony," came a deep, measured voice over the communication channel. "We have received your transmissions regarding Vorthak sentience. This is unprecedented." Sarah was sitting in the disabled Cretan ship's cargo hold, sharing her remaining water rations with the three cubs. Storm had figured out how to operate the vessel's food synthesizers, producing a protein paste that the cubs could digest. Luna was systematically exploring every system on the ship, her natural curiosity now enhanced by her ability to interface directly with alien technology. Flicker had fallen asleep against Sarah's leg, exhausted from maintaining the power flow that had kept her alive. "Unprecedented how?" Sarah asked, gently stroking Flicker's bioluminescent fur. The patterns continued to pulse even in sleep, cycling through soft blue and green waves that somehow felt peaceful. No species in galactic history has achieved technological integration at such a young developmental stage, Admiral Korath explained. These cubs demonstrated abilities that most sentient races don't develop until they reach full adulthood. Our xenopsychologists are calling it impossible. Maybe your xenopsychologists need to expand their definitions of possible, Sarah replied. These three have been surprising me for weeks. Storm looked up from the food synthesizer and made a series of clicks that Luna immediately translated into harmonic patterns on the ship's communication system. Within moments, they had established a three-way conversation with the peacekeeping vessel, using bioelectric pulses to transmit complex mathematical concepts directly to the ship's computers. Remarkable, Admiral Korath breathed. They're teaching us their language in real time. Dr. Chen, how long did it take you to establish this level of communication? About 30 seconds, Sarah admitted. They're natural linguists, among other things. What followed was the most extraordinary first contact session in recorded galactic history. The cubs didn't just demonstrate intelligence, they revealed capabilities that redefined what it meant to be sentient. Storm showed an intuitive understanding of engineering principles that took most species centuries to develop. Luna displayed navigation and tactical awareness that rivaled trained military personnel. Flicker demonstrated energy manipulation abilities that bordered on the miraculous. But what impressed Admiral Korath most was their ethics. When peacekeeping officers arrived to arrest the unconscious Cretan raiders, the cubs interceded. Through their newly established communication link, they argued for medical treatment and fair trial rather than summary punishment. They had every right to demand vengeance against those who had tried to enslave them, but instead they chose mercy. These cubs are displaying moral reasoning more advanced than many adult civilizations, Admiral Korath observed during a private channel to Sarah. Where did they learn such concepts? Sarah looked down at Flicker, who had woken up and was now teaching the ship's computer to recognize Vorthak emotional states through bioluminescent pattern analysis. I think they learned it from each other. And maybe they learned some of it from watching me. The implications of that statement hung heavy in the air. If Vorthak cubs could learn human ethical concepts through observation, it meant their species had cognitive flexibility beyond anything previously encountered. They weren't just intelligent, they were adaptable, empathetic, and capable of moral growth. Admiral Korath's next words changed everything. Dr. Chen, the Galactic Council has issued an emergency declaration. As of this moment, Vorthak are granted full sentient status with all accompanying rights and protections. Their homeworld and all colony territories are now under galactic peacekeeping protection. But there's a problem. Sarah felt her stomach drop. What kind of problem? There are currently 47 Vorthak adults and juveniles in private collections, fighting rings and research facilities throughout the galaxy. They were acquired legally under the previous classification as non-sentient predators. But now they're enslaved people who need to be rescued, Sarah finished. Exactly. And the rescue operations will be complex. Many of these facilities are heavily defended. Some are in contested space where we have no jurisdiction. A few are owned by species that don't recognize Galactic Council authority. Sarah understood immediately. This wasn't just about 3 cubs anymore. It was about an entire species that had been systematically exploited because the galaxy had been too blind to see their intelligence. Storm had been listening to the conversation through the ship's communication system. He made a series of rapid clicks to his siblings, and their response was immediate and unanimous. Their bioluminescent patterns shifted to determined gold, and they began accessing the ship's star charts. What are they doing? Admiral Korath asked. Sarah watched in amazement as the cubs began marking locations throughout the galaxy, places where their people might be held captive. They were volunteers for their own species' liberation. They want to help with the rescue operations, Sarah translated. They're saying they can communicate with captive Vorthak in ways that no other species can. They can coordinate escapes, provide technological assistance, and serve as proof that their people are sentient beings who deserve freedom. Absolutely not, Admiral Korath said firmly. They're children. We cannot expose them to that kind of danger. Storm's response was to interface with the ship's tactical systems and display a combat simulation showing how 3 cubs had disabled an entire Cretan raider fleet. Luna added navigation charts showing how they had guided Sarah through impossible terrain to safety. Flicker contributed power consumption data, proving they could maintain technological systems far beyond their apparent capabilities. "With respect, Admiral," Sarah said softly, "I think you're underestimating them. These cubs have already survived plasma storms, forest fires, cave-ins, and raiders. They've saved my life multiple times, and they have abilities that could make the difference between successful rescues and tragic failures." A long silence followed. When Admiral Korath spoke again, his voice carried new respect. "Dr. Chen, would you be willing to serve as their advocate and translator during these operations? The Council is prepared to offer you a special appointment as Xenocultural Liaison for Vorthak integration." Sarah looked at Storm, Luna, and Flicker, who were watching her with obvious intelligence and trust. They had chosen to follow her into danger once already. Now they were asking her to help them save their people. There was really only one answer she could give. "When do we start?" The cubs' bioluminescent patterns erupted in brilliant displays of joy and determination. They were no longer just survivors of a burning nest. They had become freedom fighters for their entire species. And they had a human ally who would never abandon them, no matter how dangerous the path ahead might be. 6 months later, Sarah stood on the bridge of the GPS Harmony, watching the final liberation operation unfold. 47 Vorthak had been rescued from captivity across the galaxy, and every single operation had succeeded without loss of life. The cubs, no longer cubs really, as they had grown significantly during their adventures, had proven to be the most effective rescue operatives in galactic peacekeeping history. Storm had become a master tactician, his natural intelligence enhanced by exposure to dozens of different technological systems. He could disable security networks, coordinate multi-team operations, and had personally led the assault on the most heavily defended facility in the Outer Rim. The rescued Vorthak had immediately recognized his authority despite his youth, following his tactical guidance with absolute trust. Luna had developed into a phenomenal pilot and navigator, her ability to interface with ship systems making her capable of maneuvers that defied physics. She had successfully extracted teams from 3 impossible situations, including a rescue from a space station orbiting a black hole. Her fellow Vorthak called her Starweaver in their native language, and even hardened peacekeeping pilots spoke of her skills with reverence. Flicker had grown into his power in ways that amazed everyone. His bioelectric abilities now extended far beyond simple energy manipulation. He could heal injuries by stimulating cellular regeneration, create electromagnetic shields strong enough to deflect plasma weapons, and had once powered an entire city during a planetary emergency. The rescued Vorthak cubs gravitated toward him naturally, and he had become their protector and teacher. But what made Sarah proudest was how they had retained their fundamental kindness throughout everything they had experienced. "Dr. Chen," Admiral Korath said, joining her at the viewport, "the Council has asked me to extend another offer. The Vorthak integration program needs a permanent director. The position comes with full diplomatic status and authority to negotiate directly with member species." Sarah smiled, watching as Storm taught a group of rescued Vorthak how to interface with peacekeeping computers. Luna was nearby, showing younger cubs how to read star charts, while Flicker was gently helping an injured adult recover from months of forced combat in illegal fighting rings. "I appreciate the offer, Admiral, but I think I'm needed elsewhere." "Oh, where?" Sarah pointed toward the planet below them, New Vorthak, the first official colony established by the newly recognized species. The surface was covered with crystalline structures that pulsed with bioluminescent patterns, cities that were as much living organisms as constructed buildings. It was unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. "They've asked me to be their first human ambassador," Sarah explained. "Apparently there's something about humans that resonates with Vorthak psychology. Our protective instincts, our stubborn refusal to abandon those we care about, our tendency to adopt every orphaned creature we encounter. It all translates perfectly to their social structure." Admiral Korath chuckled. "You realize that position will essentially make you the foster parent to an entire alien species? I couldn't think of a better career." Storm looked up from his teaching and made a complex series of clicks that the ship's translation system rendered as, "Sarah Packmother, the cubs request story time after evening meal. Will you tell the burning nest story again?" Sarah's throat tightened with emotion. The rescued Vorthak had adopted her as a permanent member of their extended family structure, granting her a status that no human had ever held with an alien species. She was pack mother, story keeper, and trusted advisor all in one. "Tell them I'll be right there," she said. As she made her way to the ship's main assembly hall, Sarah reflected on how much had changed since that night in the burning cave. The three cubs who had trusted a human stranger had grown into leaders of their people. Storm now headed the Vorthak Tactical Integration Program, training young members of his species to work alongside galactic peacekeeping forces. Luna commanded her own ship, the first Vorthak vessel to be granted independent operating status. Flicker had established the Vorthak Healing Center, where his bioelectric abilities were used to treat injuries across multiple species. But despite their new responsibilities and adult status, they still gathered for story time whenever Sarah visited. And they always requested the same tale, the story of how their pack mother had refused to abandon them when their nest burned around them. The assembly hall was filled with Vorthak of all ages, their bioluminescent patterns creating a soft, multicolored glow throughout the room. Storm, Luna, and Flicker sat in the front row, their eyes bright with anticipation despite having heard this story dozens of times. Long ago, Sarah began, settling into her storyteller role, there was a human scientist who thought she understood courage. She had studied it in many species, written papers about it, and believed it was just another biological function to be catalogued and explained. The adult Vorthak leaned forward, their patterns shifting to attentive blue. The cubs pressed closer together, exactly as they had in that cave so many months ago. But then she met three remarkable children who were trapped in a burning forest, abandoned and afraid, and she had to choose between her own safety and theirs. "What did she choose?" called out one of the rescued cubs, though he already knew the answer. Sarah smiled. She chose them, and in doing so, she learned that courage isn't about being fearless. It's about being terrified and doing the right thing anyway. It's about refusing to leave anyone behind, even when the nest burns around you. The Vorthak patterns shifted to warm gold. The color Sarah had learned meant family safe love forever. It was a concept that didn't translate perfectly to any human language, but Sarah understood it completely. And that, she continued, is how three cubs taught a human that sometimes the most important discoveries aren't made in laboratories or research stations. Sometimes they're made in burning caves, when you have to choose between who you are and who you want to become. Storm made a soft clicking sound that meant, story, truth, always remember. Luna's silver-tipped ears twitched in agreement. Flicker's patterns pulsed in gentle waves of contentment. As the gathering dispersed and the Vorthak settled in for the night, Sarah remained in the assembly hall with Storm, Luna, and Flicker. They sat together in comfortable silence, watching the stars through the viewport. Three alien beings and one human who had become family through fire and shared choice. "Sarah Packmother," Storm said eventually, using the formal address that still made her heart swell with pride. Question for consideration. What is it? When next cubs are born on New Vorthak, will you teach them the burning nest story? Will you help them understand human courage concepts? Sarah looked at these three remarkable individuals who had grown from frightened cubs into galactic heroes, who had saved their entire species while never losing their capacity for kindness. She thought about future generations of Vorthak, who would grow up knowing that humans could be trusted, that different species could become family, that sometimes the most important choice was the hardest one. "For as long as you'll have me," she promised. The three Vorthak exchanged glances, their bioluminescent patterns synchronizing into the complex harmony that meant forever family bond unbreakable. Outside the viewport, New Vorthak turned slowly in the light of its sun, a world where children would grow up free because a human had once refused to abandon three cubs in a burning nest. And in that assembly hall, four beings from different species settled in to watch the stars together, bound by choices made in desperate times and strengthened by the knowledge that family was more than just biology. Sometimes the nest burned around you, but if you refused to leave the ones you loved behind, you could build something even stronger from the ashes.